All right, welcome to another episode of my podcast. Today we have Matti Wilks as a guest. She's a lecturer in psychology at the University of Edinburgh. Happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, um, you're an Australian, huh?
Yes, you can probably tell by the accent.
So my wife is also Australian, and it is curious to me that a lot of people adjacent to effective altruism and utilitarianism do seem to come from there. I mean, Peter Singer himself is
hmm
also an Australian. Have you noticed that yourself?
Yeah, and I've wondered the same thing. There's quite a few people that like in the kind of early founding organizations and
Hmm.
stuff that are all Australian. So what can I say? We're just great.
So, as a psychologist, do you have any hypotheses about why that's the case?
I mean, I've always thought that being able to care about others is definitely something that comes from a position of quite a lot of privilege, like being able to have
Hmm.
the resources and mental
Yeah.
capacity to do this. And so maybe, we've had really good lives and, living in Australia is a great place to be. So we have the capacity for it, but I don't have any good theories other than that, I
Hmm.
think.
Yeah, I suppose you get these parallel debates within philosophy that there's a bit of clustering about particular views. A kind of realist stance in, say, metaphysics, philosophy of science is often very common, where Australian philosophers tend to not try to speculate too much. They often try to
Interesting.
stay more grounded. And sometimes that has been described as, oh, well, the Australian sun, you can't nothing remains except sort of a hot realism rather than cold. Um, yeah, I did my PhD in Australia partially actually for that reason that
For the
the
hot
kind
sun.
of what do you say?
For the hot sun.
Part of it, but also the sort of philosophical views clustering. And it puzzled me. I read a bit about the sort of the biographies and histories of Australian philosophy. And nowadays, you get the clustering doesn't happen as much historically. I think part of the reason is that there wouldn't have been the internet around, and some more of those views would have clustered. Where, of course, people are influenced by their supervisors, and you get these Australian schools and in philosophy, you get the Berlin School, Frankfurt School, all kinds of thoughts, philosophy associated with Cambridge. But still now, even with the internet, it seems that sort of the clustering around utilitarianism, effective altruism, that seems fairly strong. Um, Not despite of, perhaps because of the internet. Perhaps that has helped. But yeah, I guess we don't really know. Um, but
It's an interesting proposal though.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'd be curious to find more out about it.
I mean, from a psychological perspective, I suppose it would be easy to look at the kind of general moral psychology studies you could do across countries and then see these different leanings towards, say, more utilitarian consequentialist thinking versus more deontological thinking. But I'm
Mhm.
not sure those studies have been done in different countries to
Yeah,
compare
I
them.
think there's been a little bit of cross-cultural work there, but I'm not
Hmm.
aware of kind of a really large scale study that's done that. So hey, maybe something
Yeah.
to look into.
So you yourself have often been linked to effective altruism, utilitarianism. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about your connection there, how you got first involved with that.
Yeah, so I was early in my PhD when I first came across the ideas in effective altruism, and it was a really positive experience where I just basically I'd always been really interested in helping others, and I wanted to use my research to try and make the world better, or however you want to think
Hmm.
about that. And I was also obviously really interested in evidence and what kind of support there could be for different viewpoints. And so when I came across the ideas in effective altruism, I thought like, wow, okay, here's other people that are doing the thing that I think is important, and there's the whole group of them doing it. So I thought that was really cool. Um, and I guess from there, I think of myself as kind of EA adjacent rather than like very, very involved in the community. So I like use a lot of the ideas and I draw on a lot of the ideas to inform my research. And I found that really helpful. So kind of when I came across the effective altruism community, I'd already started my PhD and I was focusing on
Hmm.
moral development. And I wasn't really doing anything that would be explicitly called EA aligned at that point. But over time and with the freedom that I've had through my postdocs and now as a faculty member, I've been able to kind of shape my research more in alignment with those views. I think I'm also just really lucky that the stuff I care about is the stuff that the community tends to care about too. So I'm really interested in things like moral consideration for distant others, which is kind of one of the big premises of cause neutrality, of caring about, suffering regardless of whose suffering it is. So it's just been a really nice alignment with my views.
Yeah, have you let me check. So you published quite a few papers, so kudos.
Thanks.
Um, now, yeah, I mean, your PhD, when did you get your PhD?
2018.
Yeah, so you've published a lot of papers, and one of the issues I wanted to talk about was in terms of the responses to food with clean meat.
Mhm.
But before we move to that topic, I was very interested in your research on the speciesist attitudes we can find in humans. And yeah, tell us
Yeah.
about your research there.
So when I started my postdoc, I decided one of the things I was in a really fortunate position with my postdoc that I was able to study whatever I want. I know a lot of people take postdocs and they're kind of told what research they'll be working on, but had an amazing postdoc advisor who was very willing to let me sort out my own
Oh,
ideas, which was
that's great. Yeah.
a really nice experience. Yeah. So I had decided that one of the things I really cared about was moral consideration for others, and I was doing some work on moral consideration for artificial entities with Gracie Reinecke, who was a PhD student in the lab at the time. And then I was approached by Lucius Caviola, who's my co-lead author on our paper, who had previously been doing a lot of work on speciesism, and this was something I was really interested in, but hadn't done myself. And he said, I've been doing this work on adults' attitudes to animals. Should we do this with kids? Because you're a developmentalist. And I was like, this is a great idea. So we designed a study basically where we tried to look at how children, as compared to adults, trade off human and animal lives. So research with adults shows that adults will prioritize humans over very, very large numbers of animals, and they'll do that in all these different contexts. So just a very, very strong speciesist bias. And so we expected that we would probably find something quite similar. And I remember when we were designing our studies, we were making these trade-offs. For example, would you save one person or 10 dogs, for example? And I remember thinking, oh, we're going to need to have like 1,000 animals for the children to ever pick the animals. But we decided to pilot, I think, with 10 and 50. And we found really, really quickly that children were prioritizing humans over animals just far less than adults were. So I think it ends up being that children will choose to save 2 dogs or 6 pigs over one person when you average the scenarios out. And so, yeah, this was really shocking. And I mean, quite interesting, I thought, because it just really wasn't what we expected. So we've been following up on these ideas a little bit and trying to figure out, what's actually driving it and what's going on there. But in general, it seems like children are much less speciesist than adults, and we find similar patterns of moral consideration in other areas. So as I mentioned, Gracie Reinecke's work with artificial entities. I'm also doing some work with Julia Marshall, who was a PhD student at the time, and she's now a postdoc at Boston College and soon to be faculty member at Brown. And she and I have found that children are also, younger children especially, are much more likely to say you're obligated to help people, even if those people are physically or culturally distant from you. So even if those people are very different from you or live far away, young kids still think we're obligated to help them, whereas older kids and adults don't think that we are. So there seems to be this pattern overall where younger children and children in general think that we have more moral obligations to beings that we would normally think of as being further to the outskirts of the moral circle.
This is really fascinating. Did we get anything like a discounting rate where we can plot sort of the age to how this trade-off is happening?
Not yet. So that would be very, very cool. Luke Maguire, who's a lecturer at Exeter, has been doing a little bit of work with teenagers. But right now, most of the work has been kind of with children up to about the age of 10.
Yeah.
His work has been looking a little bit more at things like conceptions of meat consumption and things like that. But I've actually just recently been awarded a grant, and one of the projects that we're going to do is look at
cool.
the moral circle from childhood through to older adulthood. And part of that, of course, is going to be how children and adults differ in their valuation of animals.
So in your previous study, for the study design, what age range did you have in children?
5 to 9 years of age.
Oh, no, that's really interesting. What could be the explanation there? We don't really know. Do you have interesting hypotheses about that?
We have lots of ideas.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any before I jump into it.
Hmm. Well, part of it could be just learning about society, that we obviously don't value animals at a one-to-one rate to human lives. And then the longer you live there, you become enculturated and absorb those values. That's probably the main hypothesis I have there, but maybe the less interesting one.
No, I think that is probably, I think that would explain quite a large part of it,
Hmm.
right? So you're going to have children, and I think if we take, for example, the obligation study, where we looked at obligations to people who are very distant or different from us, and it makes sense that young kids would learn something like, we should care about everybody, we should help everybody. And then as they get older, they learn that there's conditions on that. So, they come to
Hmm.
understand that it can be quite difficult or costly to help people, or there are certain types of people that we might not want to help, or that we should help some people more than others, as lessons that we learn from society. So I think it's simpler to learn kind of a more basic principle at the beginning of like, we should value life, or we should care about and help others. And then over time, we learn these kinds of conditions on it. I think there's also the flip side where if you are somebody who cares a lot about animals, it can be really difficult in society to see the way that we treat animals. And so if kids are going through this kind of period of learning that we don't actually treat animals very well, then it might also be protective for them to start to disregard them morally, because otherwise you have to deal with the fact that we are granting them moral status and treating them badly.
Hmm. So I wanna, there's probably studies on this as well. Perhaps nationalism then as well is something that children don't really have, where their moral boundaries just extend to all of humanity. And that's something that happens later if people get to it.
So quite young children, not this isn't nationalism exactly, but quite young children have pretty strong in-group biases where they prefer people who are similar to them, particularly if there's like a markation of group. So they say this person's an in-group and this
Yeah.
person's an out-group. There's quite a strong bias for that, and it actually plateaus off across middle childhood. So as children get a little bit older, they're less likely to show this in-group bias, or they're more likely to prioritize other things. But in general, yeah, it seems that in certain kinds of moral consideration tasks, we are seeing that children are just generally more morally expensive, which I think is really cool. I will flag, of course, there's only been a few studies on this, and it's reasonably in contrast to a lot of other moral
Yeah.
development work. And so I don't want to make too strong a claim. This is definitely something we're still exploring.
So
But
doesn't that seem to be stand sort of in contrast? On the one hand, children seem to have stronger in-group biases, but then also they extend more considerations to animals more broadly.
yeah, and so I think part of that can be the way that questions are asked. So a lot of the studies that we look at with in-group bias are things like, who do you like better, or who do you want to share a resource with? Whereas when we're talking about moral consideration, we're really talking about like prioritization of life, or granting moral consideration in a more serious or meaningful way. But I do think there's also something unique about group biases, and I haven't got, a lot of evidence or anything to back this up, but looking at our most recent work with distance bias, we ran a follow-up study where we manipulated the person who was different, and we made them an in-group or an out-group member. And there we saw that younger children started to show this preference for the in-group, whereas older children didn't. So it seems like there's something particularly compelling for really young kids, or around 4 years of age, about group biases that older kids don't show. But in all other domains here, what we're seeing is that in the context of moral consideration, younger children are more morally expensive.
And you mentioned digital minds as well.
Yes.
How do you run those experiments? Do you give a hypothetical example of a robot?
So we've done a couple of different versions. So in the earliest work, which was all the way back in my PhD, led by Kristen Summer, we basically had children watch videos of, so we'd have a little, like, we had the robot, two robot conditions, two living creature conditions, so a child and a dog, and then two inanimate object conditions, a stuffed toy and a cardboard box. And in each video, the entity just kind of did its thing. So like the dog was walking around, the stuffed toy was just sitting there. And then we placed a really large cardboard box over the top of it, and a hand came down and smacked the box really hard. And the idea was we wanted to show something that could be harmful, or could be, a morally problematic action, without the child getting to see the entity's reaction, so they weren't making any assumptions. And we weren't showing, for example, like a stuffed toy getting upset, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And so in that study, we just kind of had this hand come down and smack the box. And then we asked children, was that okay? Would it be wrong if you hit the entity directly? And we asked questions like that. In the later studies, which were led by Gracie Reinecke when I was at Yale, we had just hypothetical scenarios. So this person pushes over or says something really mean to either a boy or a robot or a toy bear, and then asked, was that the wrong thing to do? Should the person be punished? Questions like that.
Interesting. What were the results? The children
So here we see, again, the older children are the less moral consideration they grant to the artificial entities. So younger children tend to be more willing to grant moral concern. One thing that we were a bit surprised about was that we're not actually finding things like the control entities are at ground. So children and adults are still giving some moral consideration to a rock or to a cardboard box and things like that. So it does raise questions about, what do these results really mean? And we want to do a little bit more work on that. So right now, we've been discussing the idea of looking at, kind of more costly ways of signaling moral consideration, so willingness to share resources and things like that. But overall, yeah, we still get this effect where the younger children tend to grant more moral consideration to artificial entities, and they kind of younger children are also a little bit less discerning. So when you look at, for example, the study from during my PhD, younger kids grant similar moral consideration to both the robots and the dog and the child. And then over time, those two kind of separate into these two different categories where they're differentiating between the artificial life and the, human and the dog. And so they seem to kind of have more differentiation as they get older.
I wonder how that's related to theory of mind capacity. So certainly I, as a kid, had plushed animals, and I would give them personalities and do the kind of role play with them. And sort of the question is, did I act as if, oh, well, that's just imagined? Perhaps there's something more real to it, where sort of you...
So that's a fantastic point, actually. And one of the things I should have mentioned earlier with talking about potential explanations. So I think for why children are less speciesist, I think if we look at children's TV, right, there's so many animals that are anthropomorphized. Peppa Pig, there's all of these different creatures. I don't follow current children's TV, but I've seen a little bit of it, and there's, a lot of the
I hear
Octonauts and all this
Bluey
stuff.
is very popular now.
Yep, very cool, Australian. So there's a lot of anthropomorphized animals out there that young children are exposed to, and as you get older, you really don't see those effects. Like, you really don't see that happening for them as much, and so I think that's probably a big part of it.
Yeah. Now, when people turn to veganism, I suppose that often happens as well during sort of early teenage years, perhaps around 12 to 14. Did you look at the connections with that research?
So I actually have an ongoing study looking at children who chose to become vegetarian in meat-eating households between the ages of 7 and 10. So we didn't look at teenagers, we looked at younger kids. And we haven't finished analyzing the data, though we've now officially, after 4 years, finished collecting the data. So this is very exciting. So we've done 2 versions of the study. One is with children who actually made the decision between the ages of 7 and 10, and one is with adults who had made those decisions as a kid. And we have analyzed the adult data, and what we find is that we had 3 categories: meat eaters, people who were vegetarian and raised in vegetarian families, and people who were vegetarian and raised in meat-eating families, and we called them independent vegetarians. And so they independently made the decision to become vegetarian. And we find that in the retrospective adult sample, both types of vegetarians are higher in empathy, they are lower in speciesism, and lower in social dominance orientation. So we do find that there's these kind of differences in their personality traits. It's hard to know, how well connected that is to the vegetarian choice, given that it's been such a long time for them. But, it's early evidence. And so I'm excited to see what we get out of the child data when we can analyze that.
I think that's very interesting. Now, I mentioned before, you did some study in relation to clean meat, artificial meat, lab-grown meat, where I wrote a paper on this as well, and we cited your research. Although I see you have published several things on it. And yeah, when I presented that to departmental members, some of them had that seems disgusting. I could not eat that. But of course, but farmed meat, yes, that's okay. And it's really interesting that some people have this very strong disgust response. Certainly, I myself, if I had imagined this in the past, I've grown in a lab. But where does this attitude come from? And it doesn't seem like there's a good justification for that. And maybe you figured out the reasons for this.
No, I think it's a fantastic question. I put together a grant to try and explore this. So we were really interested in looking at kind of historically and developmentally the emergence of these naturalness preferences, because if you look at the literature, there's amazing work out there. So like Paul Rosen, of course, has a lot of work on this, and there's just some incredible studies, but most of the studies are kind of telling us under what conditions do we see things as natural or unnatural? So we know that like making a chemical change affects naturalness more than making a physical change, for example. But we don't really have a good sense of the bounds of what we consider natural and unnatural at this point. And it seems to me, just in my own thinking, that it's something like it tends to be something that goes in the body. So whether that's food or something to do with sex or something to do with medicine or vaccines, that's the context in which the terms tend to get used. But really, I don't think we have a good answer for why this preference is there at all.
Yeah, they should just run some studies on this in Germany, because I think Germans have a particularly strong bias towards what they consider natural foods and medicine. Homeopathy, I think, it even came from Germany. It's very popular.
Didn't
And
know
in
that.
Germany, it's often described as Naturmedizin, natural medicine. And then you get big pharma and that untrustworthy. It's artificial. It's not natural, and it's so strong in Germany. I'm very puzzled by that.
I spent a month in Leipzig last year
Yeah.
for a research visit, and I did notice that like the way like the food that people eat and the approach to medicine and stuff seemed very like interested in naturalness. And I don't think it's all bad, right? I think there's something to be said for some tendency to prefer naturalness, but the extreme that it gets taken to and the way it gets used in marketing and all of that seems quite problematic to me. So we tend to not use the word natural in our house.
It is a strange distinction in philosophy. Often this appeal to nature has been made, and then was it John Stuart Mill who said, "Oh well, look, there's a lot of things that are natural, but there's nothing good about them. Disease, hurricanes, the like." But yeah, there is this idea that, or you get this as well with, say, the discrimination faced by people with diseases or disabilities. That, oh, that's unnatural. Hence, there's something morally bad almost about it, right? And it's very strange how strong this psychological association is between unnaturalness and sort of morally dubious.
So one of the things I like to do is ask people when they talk about natural things, like, what does natural actually mean? And so far, no one's given me a good answer.
Right.
But I think it can be, are you familiar with John Haidt's moral dumbfounding work?
Yeah.
So sometimes, and I know that work is very controversial, I think it's quite interesting, but I think sometimes when you're thinking about something that maybe feels bad or makes you uncomfortable, so there is work, for example, linking like novelness and newness to more negative perceptions of technology. So the exact same technology, if it's been around for 50 years, is more acceptable than that same technology if it's only been around for 1 year, for example. So that was Yoel Imbar and colleagues. And I wonder if saying something's unnatural is kind of a way that you can say, I have a bad feeling about this. I can't exactly put my finger on what it is, but unnatural seems to get at this. But of course, that only applies in certain contexts. You wouldn't.
So it seems like a kind of post hoc rationalization of these negative feelings.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm thinking and what I've been thinking about in the context of my work. So we have a little bit of indirect evidence to support that. So we find that, for example, people who are higher in disgust sensitivity, conspiratorial ideation, things like that, distrust in science, those people tend to be more likely to think of cultured meat as unnatural and disgusting, and particularly more likely to say things like cultured meat would be wrong no matter how small the risk and how great the benefits. So this kind of idea of it's absolutely wrong rather than it's wrong because of the possible outcomes, which I think of as relevant to morality or a moral judgment.
Yeah. Huh. No, I wonder. I mean, we made a hypothesis in the paper that as the price reduces and it's suddenly cheaper than buying farmed meat, those moral attitudes will shift.
I hope that you're right.
Yeah.
I guess quite a few kind of cultured meat companies have, or people that work in the cultured meat space have held similar views. And I think on one hand, I do think that price is a massive barrier. Research repeatedly shows that price, taste, and convenience are really big things that affect decisions that people make in the food space. But I do also worry when you think about things like genetically modified foods. They've had really negative attitudes now for 30 or more years, and I think one of the things that benefits genetically modified food is that the concept is quite vague and unclear. And so you could, any kind of genetic modification, even if that's breeding, could technically be classified as genetically modified, right? So it's not like there's one particular thing people can avoid, whereas I assume that cultured meat even when it gets into supermarkets, is something that will need to be explicitly labeled and made clear what people are purchasing. And so if there is a negative sentiment, there's much more capacity for people to avoid products like this. And so I really hope that you're right and that price, taste, convenience is the whole thing. I just personally, as someone who thinks that it would be really nice if we weren't reliant on large-scale industrial farming, I don't want to assume that that's going to cover everything.
I mean, already, I mean, because most people would probably say, oh, the large-scale industrial farming we have is bad, while they still consume those products.
Yeah.
So they recognize, oh, it would be more ethical to buy, say, the kind of meat on, say, huge farms where cows have, say, a lot of space, or chickens are given much more space. And yet they still buy what they recognize themselves as the less ethical options in virtue of the price difference.
Yeah.
And so that leads me to think that even if they think there's something perhaps more dubious about the artificial meat, although maybe unnaturalness has a stronger motivation factor than more this, perhaps more background thinking of, yes, this is more harmful. Although you might also think of these farms as just being very unnatural in terms of the lives these animals live.
So when researchers have tried to improve attitudes towards cultured meat and naturalness, one of the things that comes up is saying something like, well, traditionally farmed meat is also unnatural. And that tends to have the most impact on improving attitudes. But I guess the biggest distinction between, unnaturalness and, for example, ethical considerations for animals and how each of these affects our purchase behavior is that the first one is having a direct impact on you, whereas the second one isn't. So it's a proximal versus a distal motivation. And it's much easier to ignore distal motivations for other creatures or for other people than it is to ignore things that affect you directly. And so that's another reason I'm slightly more concerned, I think, than you from the sounds of things. But yeah, it would be really great if once it's available and the price goes down, that people are willing to eat it.
I suppose
Or
it's
even
hard
excited to eat it.
That's right. Maybe. I mean, Peter Singer uploaded this post on Twitter where, for the first time in decades, he ate meat, his artificial meat. He
I'm
seemed
very
pleased
jealous.
with it, right?
I really want to try it.
Yeah, but it's probably takes a while in the UK to become legal. Not sure about the legal status at the moment. Germany would probably be very slow with it. These different attitudes.
I know
Australia would seem like a country that would adopt it fairly quickly.
there's currently discussions through the like Australia, New Zealand food standards that they're looking at the regulation for it. I know Italy has tried to ban cultured meat, or Italy has banned cultured meat, but apparently if the EU approves it, then that should override that ban. But I'm not exactly sure how food standards work in Europe yet.
Yeah, I mean, farmers are a big lobby group, of course. Any country really, maybe not Singapore, but yeah, because in Brussels, as well as Germany, at the moment you often see news with farmers blocking the streets, parliament with trucks unloading, yeah, well, unpleasant stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, they get in the news quite a lot. So it's a big interest group. And clearly for them, wouldn't be that great if artificial meat becomes suddenly very popular. And yeah, thinking just from a political perspective, there might be a worry about employment. What do farmers do from then on?
Yeah, and in psychological research, one of the things, if you ask people, what are your concerns about cultured meat, people are often very concerned about the welfare of farmers and farming traditions and things like that. So I don't think it's something that we should dismiss. I think it's something the public does care about and we should take seriously.
It's true, but I guess so. I don't really envision that there would be this radical shift where from one day to another people would just switch completely. It's probably going to be very small and gradual. So it would be more of a phasing out approach, which might not be as worrisome.
The plant-based alternative market is the same thing, right? Like it's
Yeah.
taking over portions of the market, but not the entire thing. So I don't like to make strong predictions about timelines because, how good is anybody at forecasting? Probably there are a lot of people better than me, but I don't imagine that cultured meat would take over completely in my lifetime. Like it doesn't seem plausible to me. But I could always be wrong.
Yeah, I guess I'd have to look at estimates of how the price will develop over the next years. That's interesting to see. Because at least in principle, it seems like if you put this as a really large scale, it might become much cheaper. Um,
Although there
Hard to
was that recent
predict.
New York Times article basically arguing that cultured
Hmm.
meat is never going to work at scale, and
Interesting.
was kind of talking about technical and scientific barriers to large scale production and issues with cells and stuff. So that was
Hmm.
a week or two ago, I think, a pretty negative take on cultured meat as a viable
Right.
product.
Well, who wrote it though? Or who? Yeah,
Actually, I can't remember, which is terrible.
it's hard to say. I mean, probably could get this in journalism as well, where someone might be a bit biased towards one side or the other, which is often, for instance, in a space of, say, uh, nutrition sciences, you get these huge interest groups. I mean,
Yeah,
vegans are an interest group, and this is why that they might present evidence in a way that sort of overstates the health benefits of
yeah.
turning vegan, and that has turned a lot of people quite off. But at the same time, you also get a lot of interest groups with, say, meat production. Meat actually doesn't have ill health effects. And then it becomes really hard for the ordinary consumer to look at this research and think, the people
Yeah.
say the complete opposite from each other. How do I know what a scientific path here is to eat healthy?
And then, of course, it has flow-on effects of if you feel people feel like they can't trust scientific information and
Mm,
scientific
yeah.
institutions, then you have, you know, more general problems with that kind of thing too. So yeah, it is really problematic, and it would be really nice if there was a way that we didn't have to wonder about the interest groups when,
Mm,
and also with like government policy and things, right? And who has a
right.
say there, but that's not an area that I think I can speak very confidently about.
Yeah. It would be interesting to see how children respond to scientific information. They probably absorb it more readily. They're like, oh, okay, if this is what science says, I'll believe it.
Yeah, so I actually, this is a slightly different topic, but I have a paper showing that even from around the age of 5, young children prefer natural food. So they'll
Hmm.
choose to eat an apple that is grown on an apple tree rather than an apple that's made in a lab, for example, or like orange
Hmm.
juice that hasn't had chemicals added and removed from it. So really, really young kids also have this
Interesting.
naturalist preference.
So how do you present that distinction to the children? Because I assume the apples would look the same.
Yeah, so we use just hypothetical
Yeah.
scenarios. So we have little pictures on a screen and we say like, so this apple was made in a lab and this is how it was
Hmm.
made, and we ask them, the perceptions of that apple. And then we say, okay, now this apple was grown on an apple tree, and we
Hmm.
ask them about the perceptions of that apple. And then I think we had another intermediate condition, which was this apple was grown on an apple tree inside a scientific laboratory to see like, is it just the
Hmm.
presence of being in a lab, or is it specifically about being made? And
Interesting.
so you
Yeah.
get, the most positive attitudes for the apple on a tree, then on the tree inside the lab, and then the least positive attitudes for the apple made in the lab.
Hmm. Do you think that might just be status quo bias? Because presumably these children know that any apple they had so far comes from just from nature, so they don't know what these apples might be like.
I think that would be some of it. We also asked children about,
Hmm.
why they chose the apples that they chose, or why they thought that. And they were some kids mentioned chemicals, some kids mentioned things like, oh, we want to know that it's fresh and it's had lots of sunlight. So I don't think it's just that they're
Hmm.
saying like, well, this is how it's always been done, so this is what's best. They have reasoning, but
Yeah.
that reasoning could be motivated by what they used to, which is, what that work that I mentioned earlier about
Right.
newness shows as well. We're much more comfortable with things once they've been around for a while.
Hmm. Yeah, it might be good to think about some food products we could think about that are produced under something like lab-like conditions that children probably ate. But I'm not sure I have good examples. Maybe.
Like chips,
Oof.
like cheese
Yeah,
chips
that's
and
a good
stuff like that.
example,
Yeah. So
probably.
there's a lot of food that's produced in labs or in vaults or things like
Hmm.
that. But I think it's a big part of it is the unusual thing. We also had a condition that we ran that I think we didn't end up um, finishing, but we were looking at an unusual farmer. So like a farmer who did things really differently, like dressed differently and did all different things, but
Hmm.
produced food in the same way. And there was not much of a negativity there. So
Interesting. Yeah.
the unusualness definitely has to be about the food specifically to have the impact. But we also ran a cultured meat study with kids, which I never finished because it was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And obviously you need
Hmm.
to do that in person. And we told kids about cultured meat, traditionally produced meat, and then something that we called blick meat that we said tastes so bad it makes you want to throw up. And the ratings were, traditionally produced meat the best, followed by cultured meat, and then blick meat. But then I gave them what I told them was these 3 different kinds of meat, but it was just little twiggy sticks of all the same meat. And they ate all of them. Even if they said that they thought they were terrible, they would still eat them. So I thought, oh, I don't know what to make of that. Yeah, kids are willing to eat anything.
Very exploratory, having curiosity. At least you see that in children, right? Curiosity is very high. They might just taste it and, oh, I don't notice any difference. I can eat the rest.
Well, we went so far as for the blick meat, we put black dye on it and covered it in vinegar so it would smell bad, and they still ate it.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Okay.
But I think also in that context, you know, we're in a lab, they're coming into the lab with researchers that they've probably at some point interacted with before, or at least they've come into this lab before and they know that this is where you go to do studies. So it's a pretty safe environment. I wonder if it would be a little bit different if it was in a different context or with people that they hadn't interacted with previously.
Yeah, I wonder about, say, multivitamin pills, whether there's any reservations people might have towards that, because clearly that's very much produced under lab-like conditions, right?
Yeah, so I think there's a little bit of a difference in perceptions of food versus medicine. Like it's more acceptable for medicine to be unnatural, but I think it's only under certain conditions that it's okay for medicine to be unnatural. There's a really great study actually where they ask, I think it's Lee and Chapman, they ask people about a vitamin C pill that's produced with orange or a synthetic vitamin C pill. So like a natural or an unnatural vitamin C pill. And they say, you know, which one's better? And everybody prefers the naturally produced one. And then, you know, typically the response there from authors is something like, see how irrational we are, even though we've told them these things are molecularly identical, they still prefer the natural version. But these authors actually asked them, do you believe that they're the same? And people said no.
Yeah.
So it's like people can't believe that an unnatural and a natural version of something can be exactly the same. So I think
and I guess there's this idea that, oh, look, you might reproduce all the vitamins from an apple, but maybe we don't have a full understanding of the ingredients of an apple. So there might be some beneficial ingredients that we just don't know yet.
Yeah, and so a lot of the sentiment can be things like, oh, we shouldn't be playing God when it comes to cultured meat. Like we just don't know what might happen and all of this kind of stuff. And I think there's something to be said for that. Like historically, we've had a few cases of, you know, not doing things as well as we could or having issues with that. And so I do understand the sentiment, but I don't think that from my perspective anyway, that those kinds of risks are a reason not to try to do good things. And I think people often focus on the negatives that come out of unnatural foods and GMOs and things like that. But think about something like golden rice, which has the potential to really help with vitamin A deficiencies. And I think it is worth trying to do those things to reduce suffering and make people's lives better.
I wonder, fish might be a good example where you get these debates between farmed fish and wild-caught fish, and farmed fish get this, you might say, highly artificial diet.
Yeah.
They might try to enrich that in various ways so that they have enough, say, omega-3 fatty acids. And yet it still seems like the consensus is, from both a scientific perspective, that wild-caught fish is healthier.
Okay.
And there's this general public attitude, well, they eat these natural foods, so that must be better. It would be interesting to see. Oh, but I guess there's a consensus here between the scientific case, between the scientific opinion and the public. So maybe not. You would need something with us more contra position.
I think it's also, I mean, not so much about naturalness, but people have this attitude. Some people have the attitude that, you know, any animal in captivity is a bad thing. Yeah. But I think in some cases you can have, in the right environment, an animal can have a better life in captivity than it would in the wild, because there's a lot of suffering and a lot of, you know, stress and stuff in the wild that they're not going to have. And so I think sometimes it's just the way we reason about things. We're not necessarily thinking through what the counterfactual is and challenging that.
No, that's interesting. So I just finished the book with my wife, Heather Browning, who started out in zoos and then turned to become a philosopher of animal welfare science. And there is this widely shared view that zoos are inherently bad for animals, that they're not just bad because the conditions provided to these animals are suboptimal, but that being in captivity itself is just inherently harmful to these animals, regardless of how life in the wild might be.
Yeah.
And we really tried push back hard against this view, because life in the wild isn't actually that romantic, right? you carry diseases, parasites as animals typically, and life is short. It's historically, of course, true that a lot of zoo animals often lived shorter lives than their wild counterparts. And back then, I think you could make that argument quite well. Probably elephants live worse lives in zoos. But then that's a bit cherry picking the animals where those differences seem the most clear. And Hedda put a nice story in the book where so maybe a 10-year-old child came to her after a talk she gave on owls and the surprisingly long lives they live in zoos compared to the wild. And she said, I thought all anim that must be an exception, right? Being in a zoo is bad for animals, right? And she said, no, actually, most animals have longer lives in zoos than in the wild. And this girl was very puzzled. I was like, what? That I thought zoos are bad, and that changed her view, and was part of the motivation to write this book to give this more public information that just because zoo environments might be unnatural doesn't mean they're bad. They might
Yeah.
actually be better for a lot of animals. And that would be perhaps interesting to look at as well. I'm not sure there's any empirical research on children's attitudes to zoos and captivity there.
The work I know mostly is about how exposure to zoos affects kind of conservation attitudes and can intend for animals. I'm not sure if I've seen any work, and maybe it's out there, I haven't found it yet, on children's attitudes towards animals in captivity, but it seems like, yeah, a really
Yeah.
interesting question.
Yeah. No, I guess that is a basic difference you often get with utilitarians versus more
Yes.
deontological approaches, right? Where the utilitarian isn't gonna think about, well, is it natural or not? It's kind of irrelevant to the
Yeah.
question, right? Or whether something is good or not. But sort of the utilitarian kind of thinking studied by people like your co-author Lucius Caviola, it seems like a minority sort of perspective typically. Of course, maybe there are 10% utilitarians who think like that. Um, but typically, we don't have that. Typically, we do think in more in these strong categories where something falls on one side or the other.
Yeah.
It's interesting then to think that maybe children, at least when it comes to empathy, to animals far distant from us, they don't have this very categorical way of thinking.
Yeah, so I actually don't know if there's been a lot of work on children's utilitarian and deontological judgments. I feel like
Hmm.
I read about something a few years ago, but I haven't looked into it recently. But that seems also quite interesting to see, at what point do children start reasoning based on, because
Hmm.
if the idea that we're working with, that they kind of start out with these principles of like you should help others, and then over time you learn the conditions under which that has impact, it'd be interesting to see how that would interact with something like utilitarian type reasoning. But we certainly see across many, many different studies that children are kind of showing these preferences to prioritize beings that are distant from them and things that you wouldn't see necessarily
Hmm.
under a simple, prioritize your family kind of rule. So I think there's capacity for children to be utilitarian reasoners.
Yeah, I recently had an episode on effective altruism and the kind of opposition that is often brought against it. What has been your response to a lot of the pushback the effective altruism movement has gotten?
So I'm going to make sure I frame this correctly.
Yeah.
I find a lot of the ideas and the principles of effective altruism really, really good. I think that, of course, we should try to help others as much as we can. And of course,
Hmm.
we should help them kind of regardless of who they are, like cause neutrality, things like that. I do have some concerns kind of with how these ideas get communicated or how accessible the community can be
Hmm.
to certain kinds of people. And so that's a slightly different critique. But in general, I think that a lot of the arguments that I hear opposing effective altruism don't seem to be particularly well reasoned. Of course, as a philosopher, I don't spend a lot of my time trying to determine how good other philosophical arguments are
Hmm.
because I'm not trained to do that. But it doesn't, a lot of them don't seem compelling to me. I'm also mindful that as somebody who does, value a lot of these perspectives, I'm going to be more defensive. And so I try to remember that
Yeah.
when I'm reading things. But I think in the context of long-termism, that's been the area that I've personally struggled the most
Hmm.
because I do worry about when you have such a big denominator of people, right? If you're thinking about the almost infinite potential future people, that is an easy way, or that is a way to justify, actions now that could be negative, or, not even negative, but just like not positive, for things that we could be doing now at the expense of people now or animals now for those in the future.
Yeah.
And I think long-termism is important, and I do think it's something we should take seriously. The question I have is just, how seriously, how many resources should be going into this? And I think the reality is, in the scheme of things, so few resources are going into these things that it's probably not something to be concerned about, but it's certainly something that I wrestle with.
Yeah, maybe something interesting to explore in your research, where we could ask children whether, say, the life of someone 100 years from now matters the same or less.
Currently doing that.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of studies where we're asking children to make trade-offs between sort of 1 and 10 of different species, but also looking at different ratings, like moral consideration ratings. And we're looking at a number of different kinds of distance. So like evolutionary distance, humans versus animals, physical distance, and cultural distance, so people who are very different, as well as temporal distance, so people who aren't yet alive. And so we say, would you prioritize one person who's alive now, or 100 people who will be alive in the future, or one person who's alive now, or one person who'll be alive in the future? And we have not finished analyzing the data, but again, looking at the way children are responding when we're running these tests, it does seem like they're much more likely to prioritize future people compared to adults. But I haven't run the data, so I don't want to make a strong claim there. But that seems to be where it's going.
Or any of the suggestions for research, you're already doing it. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, it was nicely fitting. So thank you. Hopefully we'll get something interesting out of it.
Yeah, so do you know who Lucius Caviola did his postdoc with?
Josh Green.
Josh Green. I think he is also doing research in this area, and probably more related to the moral attitudes. But yeah, it's interesting to see that we get this subset of psychologists now are really interested in these questions.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember when I started my PhD, so I started in 2015, and there was definitely no research looking at this kind of stuff. I was involved in some of the really early moral expansiveness with kids work that was led by Carrie Neldner and Charlie Crimston. And yeah, in the last, say, 3 or 4 years, it's just been this explosion of people that are interested in these questions of moral concern for distant others. And it's really nice because, when you're a researcher, for example, that studies racism, nobody thinks, oh, well, why are you studying racism? Do you have a bias in yourself that's motivating this work? Whereas if you're someone who studies moral consideration for animals or for future people or any of these kind of currently groups that currently don't have moral standing, I think you get questioned a lot more, and people are a lot more kind of curious about why you're doing this and what your own views might be. And so it's really nice that there are more and more people out there now who are interested in these questions. There's a bunch of work happening looking at long-termist beliefs, so what kind of people have these long-termist attitudes and how that relates to moral consideration, things like that. So there's a lot of really cool work happening. It's a great time to be in the field.
Yeah, Richard Yetter-Chappell, who I had on, has done some work on how we can square the kind of maximizing principles of utilitarianism, where I myself have, yeah, oh, look, utilitarianism seems to demand so much. In a way, you could give all your money away and live this life at bare subsistence, because your money could do so much more in any, say, third world country where you could help many more people. But then that doesn't really seem to convince any real utilitarian to give that much away. Yeah. Even Peter Singer says, oh, look, maybe 10%, maybe that's something good to aim for. And now a lot of utilitarians have responded that, look, utilitarianism doesn't have, in a sense, actions that are right and wrong. That's like more a deontological distinction, and it's more about actions being better or worse. And now, look, your actions, they can still be good. They can make the world a better place. But then perhaps the motivation you might get from, oh, well, I could do even more good, might not be as strong as long as you're not making the world a worse place, say, with your actions, right?
Presumably there's a diminishing returns as well, right? So like if the amount of good that you're doing versus the trade-off to you is going to start having this curve
Right.
if once you're pushing up to that, giving away 70-80% of your income, for example. So
Yeah.
yeah, maybe that's a kind of softer way to think about it. I
Mm.
always used to think, well, can't we just use this as a guide rather than
Mm.
like a rule that we have to follow right through to its logical extension?
Yeah, and one idea he emphasized was that we could think more about willpower,
Hmm.
because the idea of satisficing utilitarianism, that there's some magic line that, oh, you just have to do this much. But that always seemed implausible to me, because how would we ever determine this line? But if you think about willpower, it actually becomes much more plausible, where we can say, look, if think about blaming people for actions. People are often quick to blame someone, even if they might have, say, a chronic disease where they have absolutely no willpower left because all the energy is depleted. And we almost treat it like willpower is infinite. But if you think, oh, I mean, it's not quite like a resource, but at some point you just can't do more. Say someone who tries to go to the gym, tries to eat healthier. You might not be able to do the perfect way of doing everything. There might be a certain limit. And similarly, when we think about doing good, that has to sort of compete against some of your own interest at some point. And then we think about, well, how much can you give while still being under the constraints of not going beyond what willpower you have? And then this might shift the question to maybe effective altruist foundations funding research into willpower and how we could improve willpower in people. So once they have more willpower, they have more energy to do more good, right?
No, it's an interesting point. I mean, I guess I'd never thought about it explicitly in the concept of willpower, but I,
Hmm.
I do worry a lot about both for effective altruists, but this is also a similar you see with young, people who are trying to get into academia and do research of this idea that
Hmm.
you just always have to be doing more and doing better.
Yeah.
And I think it's obviously really problematic and it's really not good for anybody's mental health. I
Hmm.
spend a lot of time trying to get people to care for their mental health.
Yeah.
And I think in the effective altruism community, because I think the kind of person that is attracted to the effective altruism community is the kind of person who already wants to do good. And I think in a lot of cases
Hmm.
probably already has a lot of guilt and a lot of like drive to try and make things better. And so I think in some ways the effective altruism community can be a really nice space for people to find other like-minded people. But you can also get into the situation where you're, because the norms around you are to do so much, you're always
Hmm.
pushing yourself to do more. And I do think in the last few years, there's been a really big shift, at least in the people that I spend time with from the EA community that are, they seem to be encouraging people to take care of themselves.
Hmm.
But it's obviously hard because yes, you're always making this trade-off. So I'd always thought about it from a mental health standpoint, but I think
Hmm.
from a willpower standpoint, it's kind of a way that you can work that into an equation a little bit better that doesn't feel like you're saying, well, I should be doing good, but I need to look after my mental
Yeah.
health, which isn't very appealing to people.
Yeah. As soon as you start sort of feeling guilt about not doing more, but you can't do more because you just don't feel like you have the capacity to do more, then at that point you can say, look, there's no reason to feel bad here. I just don't have more willpower. And I thought that's from a psychological perspective. I found that very compelling, because so many utilitarian leaning people have that problem where, oh, should I do more or not? There's always maybe this question bugging one. But I think this provides a nice line where it's like, look, I don't know, I was given, say, a day of work or something. Oh, now I have time to think about how I could make the world a bit a better place today. But I do that for a few hours. Now I go out, play with a dog, maybe, or something along those lines, to think about your own interests. Try to make yourself happy.
Which is also, I mean, I guess that's why organizations like Giving What We Can that have the 10% pledge
Yeah.
are so good because they're kind of setting a standard for people that they might be
Mm,
able to be like, okay, this is something that I don't always have to be making the decision of if I'm doing enough, right? You've
yeah.
made the decision in advance. This is what I think of as enough. And then you can protect
Mm.
yourself from kind of always needing to maximize.
That's right. And once you've done that decision once, it's not really like you have to make this decision repeatedly again. It's just taken care of. In a way, it's like building habits where,
Yeah.
well, if you just, I don't know, have a half an hour run every morning, if you look at the psychological research, I think people are much better at sticking to that than if they try to convince themselves every day of, oh, how do I now do exercise somehow? That just seems to take more willpower. So there it would be interesting to look at, yeah, well, how that sort of how can we do habit building, that research. I suppose that happens less with children because they have more free time where they can just do whatever they feel like in the moment, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I wonder if framing it as willpower is a better way to approach people. Because yeah, I get the sense that people don't like to think, oh well, I can't do as much because, you know, of my own mental health. Or I
Hmm.
think a lot of people see that as, and I don't endorse this at all, but see
Yeah.
that as like a weakness or a failure on their part. And
Hmm.
I disagree with that strongly. But
Yeah.
willpower is, yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it. So we need some
So
kind of like utilitarian outcome crossed with willpower
that's right. Yeah.
formula.
Do you think this could explain some of the results in children that, well, you don't, as a child, you typically don't have huge expectations on you, a lot of tasks you have to do, maybe a little bit of homework. Um, but maybe that doesn't really apply so much for the 6, 7 year old
Mhm.
children, right? And well, then you don't really have, as a child, you don't really have to think about willpower all that much. And then thinking about, oh no, we should just do these things to help people very far from us. They're not conceptualizing it perhaps in terms of, well, how much is this gonna constrain my income? Which trade-offs do they have to make? So they don't have to make trade-offs themselves. There it seems more, oh yes, of course we should care about them, but it doesn't weigh in any way on their life there.
Yeah, so I think that's a similar thing to what I was getting at, where I was saying, you know, young children learn it's good to help everybody, but they haven't yet
Hmm.
learned the conditions under which it's too costly, or
Right.
it's, you know, there's all these potential reasons that you might not want to help. And so I think that definitely explains part of it. But even when we present these dilemmas as trade-offs, children are still prioritizing humans over animals less than adults are, right? So they are capable of making the trade-offs, they just make them differently. And so I don't think it explains everything, the lack of these kinds of comparisons, but I think it's a big part of it. I
Hmm.
should add as well, we also recently replicated these findings in Poland, and we
Yeah.
find a similar pattern. So it does exist outside of America, which is always nice to know. And be very cool to try and look at this kind of around many different cultures and look for these cultural
Hmm.
variations. Because you could imagine, for example, if there was a country that had, you know, much higher rates of speciesism in adults, and then you see that there's higher rates of
Yes.
speciesism in those children, that could suggest that it is something that's, you know, picked up quite young. Or if you've got, you know, different kinds of television that children watch, you could see the impact there. So I think trying to have a look at how this varies around the world would be
Hmm.
a really nice way to go. Just need to get a lot of money to do that.
Yeah, I suppose Poland would probably still count as a weird
Yeah.
country, right? There was this project in philosophy, the Geography of Philosophy project, run largely by Eduard Matsuri in Pittsburgh,
Mhm.
where a lot of the intuitions we have in philosophy, he tried to test them. But the experimental work typically done there often sort of not using the most sophisticated psychological tools the field has developed, trying to become more sophisticated in psychological methods. But typically, the research has been done in Western
Yeah.
countries. And it has been very interesting there to see how often the concepts and intuition can radically differ if you do studies in Asia, Africa.
Yeah.
Um, is there a lot of sort of momentum to do more of that research now in psychology?
Um, Yes, so definitely more
Hmm.
cross-cultural work is becoming more common. I think there's quite a few labs that are doing quite a lot. So what comes to mind is sort of Katie McAuliffe, Peter Blake at Boston
Yeah.
College. They're both doing quite a lot of this cross-cultural stuff. I think it's just, you know, so difficult to do that work and to do that work well. So
Hmm.
I think probably the best example of looking at this work across cultures is Katja Leipel's lab over at Uni Leipzig and MPI. So she's got what she calls the Child and Nature Project, and
Hmm.
they have conducted interviews with children in, I'm going to misremember, but I want to say at least, you know, 30, 50 different countries, could be higher than that. So a huge number of different countries. And then they have urban and rural sites in each of the countries as well. So just a massive project, really,
Hmm.
and really, really rich data, because they're talking to children and asking them questions and then
Yeah.
transcribing what they're saying rather than coming in with like very specific sets of questions. And so this data is incredible. And once it's out and published, I think it'll really change the field.
Oh,
But
yeah.
for now, it's like, you know, it's very difficult if you want to take, for example, a moral circle task to a different country. You need to understand what kinds of animals are the appropriate animals to put in there, and what kinds of people are the appropriate people to put into these tasks. And it can be very difficult to do that without having good relationships with people on the ground already.
Interesting. Couldn't
And
you
so,
just try to replicate those studies, say a researcher at some institutions, say in Africa or someone in China trying to replicate that study? I guess that part of the problem is that replication studies have a harder time getting into good
also
journals.
that,
So there's
yeah.
not much of an incentive to do that. But at least in terms of not having to do the kind of conceptual work to come up with the whole experiment,
Well, that's how we
that
ended
could
up doing
save.
the Polish replication, right? So I was approached by
Hmm.
Mariola, and she was said, well, let's try and replicate this here. And so we did. So, anybody out there who wants to replicate this in other countries, please feel
Yeah.
free to come and chat to me. I'm very, very eager to do it.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess that is something psychology and many other fields in science have to improve upon.
Yeah, and there's definitely a push generally for this. So there's all the, the Tomasello paper, Weirdest People in the World, back from 2010. And then my
Hmm.
PhD advisor, Mark Nielsen, has done work on this as well in developmental psychology and the biases that we have. And so there's definitely a taste for it, and people
Yeah.
want to do this work. It's just the cost of actually doing this work means that you're going to take, years and years to publish a single paper. And with academia, the
Hmm.
way that it is with publishing and
I
jobs and the job
understand, yeah.
market, it's very difficult, I think, especially for kind of earlier career academics to be able to put those resources in to do that work well. And of course, there's a sort of a sentiment. I've spent a little bit of time, for example, in Borroloola, as part of my PhD, which is a remote Indigenous community in the Northern Territory. So
Hmm.
during my PhD, I was lucky enough to go out there for a week
Ah.
and conduct some research. And the woman that I went with was a linguist who goes and visits every year. And so she has really good relationships with the community already, and which is how I was able to come in and do my work. But there's definitely a sentiment that there are kind of seagull researchers that come out, do the study, get the data, and then leave, and then the benefits are never fed back to the community, and it's
Hmm.
very much just like a one-sided relationship. And
Yeah.
I think people rightfully don't want to do that either. And so then you need to put the time in to build the relationships with the
Hmm.
communities, unless it's, somebody from that community approaching you and wanting to do this work, which doesn't happen often.
Yeah, I know, that's unfortunate. Before I did my PhD, I was quite interested in meta science, still am,
Mm-hmm.
but back then at least I was at a meta science foundation conference, the first one. And it's interesting to see, even thinking about publication bias, where the name of your institution and how foreign your name sounds, that might
Mm-hmm.
stop you from getting into the best psychology journals, right? And that's unfortunate because in a sense you might think, well, given how much research we've already done in weird nations, would be much more interesting from a purely knowledge generating position to see, oh, what results do we find in non-weird countries, right?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's really important work. It's just, yeah, very, very difficult to do.
At least in philosophy, what often happens is names are blinded in philosophy journals, and as well as the institution. So in principle, that should alleviate bias, but I think philosophy we still have more than actually in psychology.
Yeah,
Um,
so I think that's mostly for most journals, they're double blind still. I'm just thinking there's been a few papers I've submitted recently that have been only single blind. So like the person
hmm,
reviewing or who I'm reviewing I know the name of the author, but the author doesn't know the names of the reviewers. And I think there's a lot of questions about like
yeah.
the value of blind review, and it's a whole thing. And I think overall I'd probably lean towards keeping blind review, but I can
Hmm.
see that there's costs as well, especially when you've got, reviewers that are very, opposed to a particular theory or a particular set of findings. And so they can then, without revealing who they are, prevent papers from
Hmm.
getting published. But actually, this is something that I found. So I did my PhD in Australia, and then I moved to America for a few years for my postdoc. And it was really only upon moving to America that I realized how much, because, there's not a lot of moral psych in Australia. There's the Ethics and Wellbeing Hub at Melbourne Uni has quite a few
Hmm.
researchers, but a lot of what I had studied at that point was from American researchers. And I didn't realize as a naive PhD student that everybody knew each other and everybody was like
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
collaborating and working together. And it was this, looking back, I'm like, well, of course, but you don't realize how much being in that in-group can have an impact on the opportunities that you get as an academic. And so I do think it's
Hmm.
really problematic. I don't think I have a solution for it. Um, but it seems like something that it would be nice to be able to change about how academia works.
Yeah. What's important, even if we don't come up with solutions here, at least raise those issues so we can acknowledge they exist, right?
Yes, definitely
Oh,
a problem.
thank you very much to give us this insight into your research. It was very interesting.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Yeah, and to listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I wish you a good week.